Hello everyone and welcome to another ranking video. Today we'll be talking about Led Zeppelin. Now in case you've been living under a rock, chances are you've heard of Led Zeppelin. They're one of the most popular and influential rock bands of the 70s, with a discography that's filled with classic albums and classic songs that helped redefine hard rock and in a way wrote a book on how to write a riff. So yeah, today we'll be talking about all of their studio albums from worst to best, like I did with other bands. By the way, I won't be including Caught on this list because that album is really just a compilation of rejected songs the band had throughout their discography. It's not a studio album and I don't think it will be fair to include it. But anyways, let's start with the ranking. Led Zeppelin has a rather interesting background for a lot of their albums, and if you look at the one for Presence, it's easy to tell that the band went through some rough times during that era. And that's mainly because of Robert Plant's car accident that led to him having several serious injuries, which led to him with a lot of difficulty during the recording sessions. And taking into account all of the background of this album, I guess it's easy to tell why this ended up being their most uninspired and lackluster album to date. For the most part at least, there's one very big exception that I'll talk about later. At first I didn't exactly know what was the problem with the album in particular, because a lot of it is very much Led Zeppelin, with a lot of riffs that you will expect from the band. But then I realized that it wasn't that the album had a lot of problems holding it back, although it does have some regardless, but it's more so the lack of, in that the album doesn't really just offer much and it's ultimately forgettable as a result. From the instrumentation, which feels more basic and uninventive than usual, to Plant's vocals, which aren't bad but you can still feel the effect the car accident had on him while recording it. He just simply doesn't really have any particularly memorable vocals throughout the album. That said, it does have one song that prevents it from being entirely mediocre, and that's Achilles' Last Stand. The song is not just good, but it's up there as one of the best songs that they've ever made, and considering the peaks of this band, that's saying a lot. It has some of the most energetic and powerful drums of any Led Zeppelin song, an amazing bass line, and some of the most exciting songwriting to date. It's probably Led Zeppelin at their most epic, a sprawling masterpiece. The band had already been evolving and redefining their sound with each album, but this song does still feel exceptional on the next level. But yeah, like I said, the rest of the album as a whole just feels like the band on their most uninspired yet, with riffs that often feel kind of the same. And there's even songs where they get tiring to hear after a while, like on Candy Store Rock, which, you know, it's not a bad group, but any enjoyment that I get out of it doesn't really last for the whole song, unfortunately. And then there's Hot On for Nowhere, which is probably my least favorite Led Zeppelin song yet, which on top of the song being already forgettable, it has their laziest and most annoying hook yet. Like when you write a hook like this, you're pretty much uninspired. I mean, I wouldn't say this album is terrible, as Presence still feels in a way like a genuine effort that really just suffers from mediocrity than anything. But still, compared to the rest of their discography, Presence is just not really all that worth listening to, well, aside from Achilles' Last Stand, that is. Into the Outdoor, pretty much the last Led Zeppelin album before the band will go on to disband on 1980, and it's also the biggest departure from their sound, focusing much more on synths than guitars and drums. And considering the sound that the band was known for, this direction that they took seemed like it would have been a complete failure, like something that will just not feel Led Zeppelin. But I think it does manage to work around its synth-focused sound at the very least occasionally. One thing that puts it above Presence is that the songs definitely feel more inspired here. Like there was a more clear direction on what they were doing, and as a result, the album is at the very least more interesting and feels more complete. But I still will not call this a great album. There are definitely things that do drag it down a lot, like this album is probably the least engaging and interesting Robert Plant has been vocally, especially on the first track, in which I assume he probably went through like a filter or something because he does sound off on it. And there are some weird and questionable things about it as well. Hot Dog is them trying to go country and it just sounds very tacky and obnoxious. Carousel Alhambra is a mess, with a scene passage in the first half that I think just sounds wrong more than any other song that I've heard from this band. And even though the song does get better later on, it still feels like it's just too long for its own good. And the last song, even though it does sound pretty, it's rather forgettable otherwise. The album as a whole is okay, it has its moments, and songs like Fool in the Rain and All My Love do have their merits, but it's far from their best and doesn't really have any true high highs either. Like, I don't even think there's a song that I will even put in a top 30 Led Zeppelin songs list. But you know, it's still harmless, I suppose. Yeah, this is where we start to get to the albums that I can confidently say they're good. Led Zeppelin III is often known to be the album where the band leans into more folky and softer music than usual, influenced mainly by the band listening to more acoustic-centered artists like John Fahey. As far as the more folky songs go, they're alright. The songs generally have good songwriting and pretty instrumentation, but I also think the band haven't necessarily completely nailed at doing the softer songs yet, so they're also a bit forgettable in my opinion. I do quite like Gallows Pole though. It has a fun groove and I do get a lot of enjoyment from planned sarcastic energy throughout it. And the last song that people seem to hate, I actually don't mind it. It's far from one of their best songs, but I still enjoyed it as a novel experiment. And outside of Gallows Pole, the album does have several other amazing songs. It's not like Presence where it really only has one highlight. There is truly some gold to be found in Led Zeppelin III. The two songs that very much stand out the most are Immigrant Song, which is a hard rock classic that immediately sticks out for its unforgettable and intense vocals, and one of the more metallic instrumentation that we've seen from the band with a very satisfying rhythm. And Since I've Been Loving You, which is an amazing psychedelic track that feels grand and layered. The organs are great, and it has one of the most passionate vocals I've seen from Robert Plant. He's great on this track. And oh yeah, the guitar solo does speak for itself for how good it is. So despite some dull moments, Led Zeppelin III I think it's a worthy entry in the discography that still kinda remains as a consistent enjoyable listen, with some really noteworthy highs. Hey, so little fun fact, this actually used to be number 6 in my ranking, but truth be told, the album actually has grown on me a little bit when I re-listened to it for this video. So yeah, Led Zeppelin II is a pretty good album. Led Zeppelin II, the band's sophomore album and pretty much similar to their debut in terms of sound, and probably their most consistent album before Led Zeppelin IV in my opinion, even though there's still some songs that are noticeably better than others. It doesn't have as many top tier songs as many of the other records, but I feel like this is around where they fully found their sound and their identity as a band. Let's start talking about Whole Lotta Love, because this song is amazing and probably a contender for a top 5 Led Zeppelin song. It has a very creepy opening riff, some of Robert Plant's most smooth vocals to date, and the middle section of the song, which is pretty much a long psychedelic bridge, is one of the most unique and exciting moments of probably their whole discography, honestly. Whole Lotta Love is pretty much a songwriting marvel and definitely the best song on the album. But even outside of that, the album does have some great songs that aren't as close as good as Whole Lotta Love but are still very much worth mentioning. Heartbreaker has a lot of great energy from Robert Plant and an immediately catchy and memorable riff. Moby Dick is one of my favorite instrumental songs the band has ever done, and Ramble On is a very catchy tune. And even the weaker tracks of the album are still serviceable and don't really take you out of the experience. Led Zeppelin II isn't quite their best, but it has a lot of good things that people tend to associate with when talking about Led Zeppelin. It's a quite good album.
In the days of my youth, I was told what it means to be a man.
Led Zeppelin, their debut album, and probably the most blues rock sounding album in their whole discography. This album is generally a mix of original music and covers from pre-existing blues and folk songs, and as far as the quality of the album goes, the album does succeed on both fronts for the most part. Despite of what I've said about Led Zeppelin II being the album where they fully formed their identity and sound, Led Zeppelin I is still a very essential album for being one of the very first truly popular hard rock albums, and one of the essential examples on how to write great riffs and guitar solos. Led Zeppelin were pretty much popular and good from the very start, and this album does have for sure its share of classics. Good Times Bad Times is the opening track, and it does a good job at not only introducing you to the sound of the album, but to the sound of the band as a whole. You have great sounding drums with a lot of punch to them, catchy verses, great riffs, and of course, great guitar solos. It's not their most inventive song, but it's certainly one of their most fun. You also have Babe I'm Gonna Leave You, which is mainly driven by the intersection of the softer and the more overwhelming riffs. Not only you have memorable guitars that sell you the gritty emotion of the song greatly, but both the softer and the faster riffs do feel like they belong in the same track. Dazed and Confused has one of the most chaotic riffs I've ever written, and The Closer How Many More Times is pretty much a 60s acid jam that does seem to take advantage on the fact that it's a 60s acid jam. In other words, it's a great adventurous track. That said, I don't think the album is necessarily all that consistent. There's a few bluesy tracks here that aren't bad, but I think they're noticeably weaker than the better tracks of the album. One of those songs is You Shock Me, a slow blues track that never really seemed to fully captivate me. If anything, it just kinda drags on, and it's really only saved by the 3 following solos that, while not amazing, do give some spice to the song. I Can't Quit You Baby is also another kind of just okay track that I thought it was just kind of forgettable. But despite some of the few songs that I tend to be lukewarm on, and some later albums redefining this album's sound further, leaving this one a little rocky in comparison. The album overall I think is an entertaining, memorable, and pretty remarkable debut that showcased so many of the band's biggest strengths. On top of having some of the most iconic and memorable songs too, putting this one this high up on the list. Led Zeppelin I is for sure an essential listen. Physical Graffiti, the band's double album. Released late in their discography after a lineup of classic records, Physical Graffiti is kind of a culmination of all sorts, with plenty of unreleased tracks from the sessions of their older albums, and an album that is both kind of a return to the more hard rock sound that we've seen in previous entries, but also still shifts through different genres, styles, and songwriting ideas. It even goes back to centering its second half on more folky songs, kind of like what they did on Led Zeppelin III. Physical Graffiti is for sure a great album and a good showcase of the band's evolution, especially when it comes to the first half, which is honestly probably my favorite run of tracks of maybe any Led Zeppelin album honestly. The first 2 songs have some really memorable riffs and grooves, especially the Rover, which has a very sunshiny-like sound that I quite love. In My Time of Dying, which is one of my favorites and what I think is a far better version of some of the more dull bluesy tracks from the first album, mainly because of how sprawling and adventurous this track is. Not to mention very seductive as well. Also, some of the best guitar work as well, that is especially present in the middle part of the song. Yeah, the middle part of the song is just fantastic. Houses of the Holy is a very vibrant and passionate track. Tram Underfoot, which is a very groove-centered song that stands out greatly because of its funky and addicting groove that never really gets tiring to hear. And of course, Kashmir, which is not only my favorite song on the album, but it's my favorite Led Zeppelin song. In general, I fucking love the song. From the grand, chilling, and thunderous instrumentation that has a very certain Eastern-like elegance to it, to its many mesmerizing melodies, Kashmir is just phenomenal in every way. It's just so fucking good. That said, Physical Graffiti does suffer a little bit from what I like to call the bloated double album curse, in that the second half is where the weaker spots can be easily found. Don't get me wrong, there's some songs in the second half that I do quite like. For example, In the Light, which is an interesting track despite the intro going for a little bit too long in my opinion. 10 Years Gone, which has some sweet melodies and lyrics with emotional punch to them. The Wanton Song, which I like for similar reasons as Trample Underfoot but to a lesser extent. And my personal favorite from this half of the album particularly being Down with the Seaside, just because of how relaxing and bright it is. But the other tracks on the second half I think are just forgettable and a bit of a slog to get through honestly, almost as if they were songs that were just added to pad out the album to a longer length. But still, Physical Graffiti is for sure one of the most interesting and even exciting ventures from the band, with some truly amazing highs that do rank as some of their absolute best. Hey, so remember what I said about Physical Graffiti being a bit of a return to the hard rock sound that we've seen on the earlier albums despite its genre variation? Well, that was the case for that album, because this album, which came before Physical Graffiti, is arguably the most experimental and out there Led Zeppelin album, at the very least in my book. And also one of my absolute favorites, mainly because of just how unique and refreshing it feels. Houses of the Holy is a fascinating album that has a lot of my favorite songs from the band that often go to directions the band hasn't explored yet. There are songs here with melodies that are so bright and glittery, they almost don't feel like Led Zeppelin songs, with the most prominent example being The Song Remains the Same, a song that I think takes advantage of that sound to its fullest. But there are also songs that experiment with synths and atmosphere as well, the most prominent example of it being No Quarter, which is my favorite song of the album, mainly because of its enveloping atmosphere that it creates, through its synths and rather unconventional guitar tones. It's a very spacey song, and for sure one of their most interesting and unique songs. And even when the band heads to their roots more with the last track, they still pull it off greatly. The Ocean has a creeping groove, drums that give a certain special punch to the song, and the climax that it reaches in the end, it's for sure an unforgettable one. The only song that I don't like from the album is the crunch. Unlike some of the weaker spots from the other albums, the crunch isn't very good, not because it's a boring, forgettable track. Quite the opposite actually. It's a song that I think just flew too close to the sun. Like, it does have some good ideas, but the way it comes together with those annoying scenes, the most cringe-worthy vocals from Roger Plant up to that point, and just generally their approach at making a funky song that just feels too silly for its own good. Yeah, this song is kind of bad, but not bad enough for me to hate it honestly. At the very least, this one is interesting compared to the low points of their last two albums. But I would say overall that Houses of the Holy, just like Physical Graffiti, it's another album in their discography that I will consider as a great showcase of just how much the band has evolved. It's one of my favorite albums from them to come back to. Well, let's get to number 1. You probably guessed it. I mean, what else could it possibly be? Led Zeppelin is for sure a great band, with a lot of classic and acclaimed albums under its name, but Led Zeppelin IV not only is the best of them all, a part of the reason why it's so beloved and why it's the most popular Led Zeppelin album is because Led Zeppelin IV defines everything that makes Led Zeppelin great. Not just a culmination of all of the strengths from the first 3 albums, but it redefines the strengths of those records into something truly exceptional. To start off with, every Led Zeppelin album that I talked about until this point have had at least one track or two that I found particularly weak compared to the rest. But Led Zeppelin IV is the one album that breaks this rule. Every song on this album I think it's worth listening to, each one having something worth praising about. The first 2 songs, Black Dog and Rock and Roll, have some of the best groups that we've seen from the band, and they're both just so generally tight and complete as rock songs. Everything of these 2 songs just comes together greatly. The Battle of Evermore is quite a unique track, diving into a more folky direction the band has never went into, at the very least in this fashion, with the heavy use of a mandolin. And it manages to paint something quite fantasy-like through its sound. It's certainly a very memorable song. Misty Mountain Hop is fun mainly because of that really catchy groove. Going to California is just straight up a gorgeous little acoustic track with some very delicate lyricism from Roger Plant. Four Sticks has a killer kind of muted beat to it that makes it stand out. Yeah, I never really understood why a lot of people think that's like the black sheep of the album. It's great. When the Levy Breaks is truly fantastic, with just some of the most insane wall of sounds and chaotic guitar work. Truly a strong contender for maybe even a top 5 Led Zeppelin song. And then there's Stairway to Heaven, which, while I don't think it's my favorite Led Zeppelin song, again that title will go to Kashmir, it still is certainly their magnum opus, as in their ultimate achievement. This song is a towering marble that starts out as a small ballad that slowly builds up as the song progresses, until eventually concluding with a bombastic climax at the end. People have talked about this song hours on end for years, and it's the most famous Led Zeppelin song to date, even considered as one of the best rock songs of all time. But there's a reason for it. It's phenomenal, with just how much the song progresses in such an organic and satisfying way, and just how much it pays off in the end. It's a classic that deserves to be called a classic. And yeah, Led Zeppelin IV is without a doubt my pick for their best record. It's not entirely perfect. I could say Battle of Evermore goes for probably a little bit too long, and Rubber Plant has some occasionally annoying moments in Misty Mountain Hop, but it's still just the most complete and defining album in their discography. It's just a fantastic record. So yeah, that was the list. If you're interested in looking at my other ranking videos, I made one for these two other bands as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next Bell's Basement.